Hello and welcome to the Storeroom of Scripture. I'm Jeff Johnson. Today we're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 11 verses 32 through 45. Scholars of the book of Daniel are nearly all agreed that Antiochus IV is the focus from verse 21 through verse 35. We looked at the first 10 verses of that section last week. After that, opinion is split as to whether the focus remains on Antiochus or shifts to the Antichrist, the ultimate evil king, during the end times. Verses 36 through 39 are like a character sketch of evil, so they could apply to either one or both of these evil kings. Verses 40 through 45, though, are trickier, really the trickiest portion of the whole chapter. History confirms that the events described in these verses are not the continuation of events in the life of Antiochus IV. It's this disconnect that leads some to see the Antichrist in these verses rather than Antiochus. Well, that's not the only way to look at it, though, and I will propose an alternative that stays truer, in my opinion, to the immediate context of the book. Thank you for joining me as we reach the end of chapter 11 in our study of Daniel.
Today we are going to continue our study in Daniel chapter 11, a third part. And I'm going to back up as we start and just do the quick overview of Daniel 11, even quicker than last week. Underlying all of this is the idea that angels are working in the spiritual realm to achieve God's designs in human history. All the machinations that we ascribe to world leaders and decisions that they make are being either opposed or reinforced by angelic figures. At least that's the implication we get at the beginning when Gabriel says that he was standing with Michael against the prince of Persia at one point, but he was also standing with Cyrus in the overthrow of Babylon. So the angelic forces are at work, and that's one thing we will see, even though it's only explicit a couple of times in the narrative. The idea that these events could be appointed and then carried out implies that there are spiritual forces working behind the scenes to make them all occur as promised. Then we begin the great narrative, which through verse 35, most every scholar agrees on. It's a narrative that begins with Alexander the Great, his empire breaking up into multiple smaller kingdoms, and between two of them, the Jewish homeland is caught. It's caught between Ptolemaic Egypt and the Seleucid Syria. These two kingdoms go back and forth, which is the bulk of chapter 11 of this back and forth. They're constantly at war with each other. They did try to make alliances at least 2 times through marriages, but those never resulted in a ceasefire between these two groups. Then we come to Antiochus IV, who gains power through underhanded schemes. He is a member of the royal family, but not next in line when Seleucid IV dies, and yet somehow he ends up in power, and the proper king ends up as a hostage in Rome. We looked at all that last week. And then Antiochus IV, who was waging a mostly successful campaign against Egypt, when he had to come back and quell an uprising amongst the Jews, he blames the Jews then for disrupting that and for his subsequent shame at being defeated, not just by the Ptolemaic Egyptians, but by the Romans, who by this time had gotten involved. And the second time Antiochus tries to go down into Egypt, after quelling the Jewish uprising, he has no success, and he takes all of his frustration out on the Jews by outlawing the Torah and desecrating the temple. He blames not just the Jews as a people, but their religion specifically, because it was mostly an uprising centered around who was high priest. And therefore, the priesthood becomes the focus of Antiochus's anger, and therefore the religion. And so he basically tries to outlaw the Jewish religion in Palestine. Now we're going to pick up with verse 32, where he is continuing to oppress the Jews in the wake of that frustration. In verse 32 we read, "And those who violate the covenant he will seduce with flattery, but the persons who know their God will stand firm and take action." This taking action and standing firm is probably a reference to the Maccabean revolt, started by a man named Mattathias and his sons after him. I would like to flip over to the intertestamental book, popularly known as the Apocryphal book, First Maccabees. We've looked at some of that last week, and there are continuing connections. And I really want to get a sense of what Daniel 11 gives broad strokes, and First Maccabees gives some very specific details about this Antiochus oppression. So in First Maccabees chapter 2, verses 17 and 18, we read this. "Those from the king responded and said to Mattathias," I should set this up before. The king is Antiochus IV, who has sent people to Jerusalem specifically to tell them to follow Antiochus and to give up their Jewish ways. And so he makes such a statement, and then during that statement he says to Mattathias this. He says, "You are a ruler and honored and great in the city and supported with sons and brothers. Now come first and act on the command of the king, as all the nations and the rulers of Judah and those remaining in Jerusalem have done. And you and your house will be among the friends of the king, and you and your sons will be honored with gold and silver and many gifts." So there's that flattery, if he will follow Antiochus's rules. Well, he gives something of a response, but then we read Mattathias' response is no. And then we read here a little bit later in verses 25 through 28. "The man from the king who had forced him to sacrifice, Mattathias killed at that moment and tore down the altar. And he was zealous for the law, like Phinehas did to Zimri, son of Shallum. And Mattathias shouted in the city with a great voice, saying, 'Everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant, come out after me.' And he and his sons fled into the mountains, and they abandoned everything they had in the city." So, obviously a negative response to the representative of the king. And he rallies around the faithful to himself and leaves. Now, I'm hoping that you're hearing a little bit of an echo of Jesus' statement in what we call the Olivet Discourse, when he's talking about the future and he's talking about the desecration, and we already know he's alluding to Daniel when he talks about the abomination that causes desolation. But in that same context, he talks about fleeing to the mountains and leaving everything behind. Don't grab anything, just leave and flee to the mountains. That seems like a clear allusion here to what Mattathias did when he left and rallied everyone with him. I think Jesus is making this connection through the Maccabees, that when this time comes, don't try to defend the city, just leave, because the city will not be the place you need to be. Now back to Daniel. In verse 33, we read, "And those who have insight will instruct the many, but they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for some time." So again, there will be faithful people still trying to instruct the many. An interesting use of the many. It seems to be, in this context at least, a reference to many Jews. For the scribes, the leaders of the law, and they're trying to teach the people what is right. And for a while they do that, but they fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and plunder. I just wanted to read one example from First Maccabees of a situation that this is referring to, among others. But in 1 Maccabees chapter 2, verses 29 through 30, we read, "Then many who sought righteousness and justice went down into the wilderness to stay there, they and their sons and their wives and their livestock, because evil pressed hard against them." Continuing verses 31 and 32. "And it was reported to the men of the king and the forces who were in Jerusalem, the city of David, that men who ignored the king's command had gone down into hiding places in the wilderness. And many ran after them, and having overtaken them, they camped opposite of them, and were drawn together for war against them on the Sabbath day. So you get the picture, and the time is important. It's on the Sabbath. I'm going to skip down a little bit for the end of the story, verses 35 through 38. And they rushed against them in attack, and they did not respond to them or hurl a single stone against them, nor block their hiding places, saying, "We should all of us die in our innocence. The heavens and the earth are testifying for us that you are slaughtering us unjustly." So why wouldn't they not defend themselves or build up fortifications? Because it was the Sabbath day. And on the Sabbath they're not to work. And engaging in warfare is work. So they would not even defend themselves because it was the Sabbath day. Well, the last verse, predictably, they rose against them in battle on the Sabbath, and they and their wives and their children and their livestock died, up to thousands of human lives. They didn't defend themselves, didn't stop the attackers from attacking. They went in and slaughtered them. This is the kind of atrocity that Antiochus and his men were doing against the Jews in this period of time. I think they're saying we are going to be a witness, basically martyrs. We're going to die as martyrs. We know we are because they're just going to come in and kill us. We're not going to defend ourselves. But we will have a testimony of faithfulness to the law, and that will inspire others to be faithful to the law. And verse 34, back in Daniel 11, when they fall, they will receive little help, and many will join them in hypocrisy. So this is emphasizing that what help they did get was just a little. The Maccabees were doing their revolt, but at the time, at least early in this process, it was little help to the people because the forces of Antiochus were just outnumbering them, and they had all the weapons. And some people were joining them in the hypocrisy, and that makes you wonder, what does that mean exactly? And I think we get a bit of that, the motivation for why that might be, again from 1 Maccabees. In chapter 2, verses 42 through 44, we read about some of this little help that was trying to gather. Then there gathered to them a congregation of Hasidians, a strong force from Israel, all who were devoted to the law. And all the fugitives from the evil joined with them and became for them as support. And they organized a force and struck sinners in their wrath and lawless men in their rage, and those who remained fled to the nations to escape. So generally we would think about this as being a good thing, opposing the Antiochus and his forces. But notice that they weren't just against the lawless men in their rage, but also the sinners. So people who had said they were going to support Antiochus or who had stopped practicing the Torah were being slaughtered along with the people that were forcing others to do it. So the general understanding about this word about hypocrisy is that some people were signing up to support the Maccabees so they wouldn't get killed in the process. They were sort of like in between. I don't really support Antiochus, but I don't want to die, so I'm just going to do what I have to do to live. And those people were getting killed by the Maccabees, who said, "You're being unfaithful, you're not being faithful to the law, so I'm going to kill you. If you don't oppose our enemy, then you're my enemy and I'm killing you." So this is the situation. So that's why some people just joined up with the Maccabees in areas where they were stronger so that they wouldn't die. In Maccabees we read that a lot of people just went to other nations. They just got out of town because they didn't want to be on either side. They didn't want to be killed by the Maccabees for not being zealous enough, and they don't want to be killed by the Antiochans for not supporting his anti-law program. So they just went somewhere else. In verse 35, back in Daniel 11, and even some of those who have insight will fall in order for them to be refined by it and to be purified and cleansed until the time of the end, for the appointed time is still to come. And this is where I'm meant that there's this idea that the death of some can inspire the faithfulness of others. Those who have insight will fall so they can be refined by it. I think that we have this pronoun them. Who is being refined by the falling of those who have insight? It's not the ones who have fallen. Presumably they're dead. There's nothing else that can be done for them. They can't be refined after they're dead. So I think this them is referring to the Jewish people generally, to the many that are out there between. So those who are wise in the law are making sacrifices in order to try to bring righteousness to the whole community, to purify and cleanse.
But there's also the reality that when established leadership leaves, new leadership has to come in and take place, and part of that is learning how to be a leader. So there's refining going on there.
Right. So that the refining is having to step up and take that role. Yeah. There is the phrase, you don't ever learn more than when you're a teacher, because stepping up to that role, you have to step up yourself. And maybe that's a bit of what's going on here with this dynamic as well. And I just want to emphasize this last bit of verse 35. They were cleansed until the time of the end, for the appointed time is still to come. Gives us 2 points of reference. There is an appointed time for the end. This isn't going to last forever. They will be suffering. And it's not yet that time, at least in the narrative as it's going. It's not yet that time, so they continue to suffer. They continue to die. New people still continue to rise up, but it's a cycle that's continuing for the meantime. But there is an appointed time when that cycle will stop, and God will intervene and do something different. Now, as I mentioned before, this verse, verse 35, is the last verse upon which there is pretty much universal agreement on what the verses mean. After this point, there is a diversity of opinion as to what's going to happen. And one of the reasons is that starting in verse 36, the narrative is going to take a bit of a step back and assess Antiochus IV by giving us a bit of a portrait of him, rather than a strict timeline of this and then this and then this and then this. And so because that shift in the narrative occurs here, and for other reasons, which I'll be talking about as we get into the interpretation, this is the division. Some people say that this vicious leader, of which these verses are a portrait, is still Antiochus IV. It's talking about Antiochus and giving us the zoom out lens of all of his evils, his character. Some say, no, this is the Antichrist at the end of time. This is the time talking about the appointed at the end in verse 35 might refer to the end of the Antiochus oppression, but it's also referring to the end of all time. And so that's our jumping off point to go into the distant future and talk about the Antichrist. Well, let's read the verses. I'm going to point out places in which they connect with Antiochus, because I don't know about this future Antichrist. Unless this is talking about him, I can't say, oh, in this verse, this is what's going to happen with the future Antichrist that looks like this verse. I don't know, because it hasn't happened yet. But I do know what happened with Antiochus, and so I can connect it to some details in his life. So that's what I'm going to do. So we'll start with verse 36 in Daniel 11. Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt himself and will consider himself above any god. And he will speak horrendous things about the God of gods, yet he will succeed until the period of anger is finished. For what is determined will be done. So, Antiochus is the king. We've already seen this phrase, though, the king will do as he pleases, multiple times. It was said about Alexander. It was said about, I think it was said about Antiochus III. I have to go back. But it's been used a couple of times already in this narrative to say the king will do as he pleases. That just means he's going to have success militarily and socially. He's going to be in power and able to make decisions and carry them out. So he's going to do that. He will exalt himself. Clearly, Antiochus did that. Nearly every king does that, exalting yourself above others. But he considers himself above any god. What's that about? Well, Antiochus apparently used propaganda to support himself as the embodiment of Zeus of Olympus. Olympian Zeus, they refer to him. The ruler of all the other gods. And so if Antiochus says, I'm the embodiment of Olympian Zeus, he's basically putting himself in the slot of the top god above everybody. And that's apparently what he was doing. And of course he said horrendous things about the God of gods. That would be a reference to Yahweh God. And he was clearly demeaning him with his anti-Torah campaign and killing the Jews. In verse 37, he will not pay respect to the gods of his ancestors or to the darling of women, and not to any god will he pay respect, for he will consider himself great over all gods. So again, that's a reference to him thinking he's Olympian Zeus in his propaganda. The god of the ancestors was probably Apollo. That was the highest god amongst a lot of Greek culture. Apollo, there was a sun god, and so Apollo was the god that they most honored, even above Zeus. But in their particular Greek culture, Apollo was their thing. Yes, they acknowledged Zeus, but they worshipped Apollo. As far as this darling of women, the best identification that's been suggested is Adonis, who even today, if we say that man is an Adonis, we mean he's the epitome of masculinity and attractiveness. But he doesn't respect either Adonis or Apollo because he's all about Olympian Zeus, and he thinks he is the him. Instead, he will honor the god of fortresses, a god whom his ancestors did not know. He will honor him with gold and with silver and with precious stones and costly gifts. Now, he just said he doesn't honor any god, and now he's saying he's honoring the god of fortresses. I think this probably doesn't mean one particular god. There was actually Jupiter, and Jupiter, is like the Roman equivalent to Zeus, so it's still a high god. But Jupiter Capitolinus, in that particular aspect, was known as a god of fortresses, castles and fortifications and so on. So it could mean that. But I think it probably just means he honors fortifications. He's all about building fortifications, building citadels, and places like that. And in fact, Antiochus built a place called the Acra in Jerusalem, in which he housed his own Syrian forces. He built a fortification for his own people in Jerusalem. And then he gave that Syrian contingent superiority over the Jews. I mean, it's basically like Rome occupying it. This was Antiochian forces occupying Jerusalem and enforcing the law, Antiochus' law, and he actually paid those Syrian forces with property confiscated from the Jews that he had been persecuting. And he paid them in that, which I think is probably what the next verse is talking about. Verse 39. He will deal with the fortified strongholds with the help of a foreign god, and he will increase wealth for whoever will acknowledge him, and he will cause them to rule over the many, and he will distribute land for a price. This is the Lexham English Bible translation. I read other translations because sometimes how one puts in the context makes some difference on how you word things. And this idea of distributing land for a price could also be distributing land for a wage. And that makes sense, that he's distributing land to these Syrian forces. Those are the ones who acknowledge him because they're his allies, his soldiers. And he causes them to rule over the many because they have that authority over the people of Jerusalem and the area. So I think that this is what this is pointing to specifically, is this fortification in Jerusalem that is for his Syrian forces. Well, that's the end of the profile. Is it the future Antichrist? I can't say it's not, but it definitely kind of fits Antiochus in some of the things that he was doing. Then we have the last 5 verses of chapter 11, which is the final historical narrative of the chapter. Now, I'm just going to read at least a couple of verses at a time and then make some comments about them. Verses 40 and 41. And at the time of the end, the king of the south will attack him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he will advance through the countries, and he will sweep through like a flood. And he will come into the beautiful land, and many will fall victim. But these will escape from his power, Edom and Moab and the best part of the Ammonites. All right, I think I'll take a moment here to point out, whatever this is, it is not a continuation chronologically of where we left off in verse 35. Because Antiochus never again invades the south. After he is beaten by the Romans and shamed by the Romans, he stops trying to take the south. He reinforces Palestine because that's the territory he does own. He wants to protect it from the south taking it, from Ptolemaic Egypt taking it. But after this, his only military campaigns are toward the east, towards Persia. He stops trying to take Egypt after that. So he does not attack the south, nor does the south attack him. This is not the next thing that happens. There are a couple of ways to take it, but I just want to point out here, this is not Antiochus, not the next thing that happens with Antiochus, if we were to read it that way. Verses 42 through 44. He will stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape, and he will rule over the treasures of gold and the silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Cushites will follow in his footsteps. But reports will terrify him from the east and from the north, and he will go out with great fury to destroy and to exterminate many. And then he will pitch the tents of his palace between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain, and he will come to his end, and there is no one helping him. So, since this isn't Antiochus' next things to happen, what does it mean? What does Daniel 11, 40 through 45 describe if it's not describing the next chronological events of Antiochus' life? Well, there are three main suggestions. First is a suggestion by the skeptical reader. I said that even skeptical readers and Christian faithful readers will read it the same through verse 35. Well, they part ways at verse 36, and the skeptic will read this and say, the writer of Daniel is just making a best guess at what's going to happen with Antiochus after 168 BC up until his death. He's been writing history, essentially, as if it were prophecy to this point, and now he's going to try his hand at some actual prophecy to write about what's going to happen with Antiochus up until his death, and he doesn't know, so he's making a best guess. That's the skeptical view of these verses. A version that comes from a person of faith who is still looking at the inspiration of Scripture will say it's a recapitulation of the events described in Daniel 11, verses 25 through 35. I don't know if you'll remember, but from last week we talked about how that last invasion of Antiochus into Egypt was actually spurred by the south. The brothers who were running Egypt at the time got bad advice from one of their advisors who said, now is the time, go up and take the land, at least take Palestine, but invade. And so he did, and ultimately got captured in the process and failed at that. But it was instigated by the south, just like this description that starts in verse 40, where the king of the south invades the north, and then there's a reprisal. And then if you look at it, I'm not going to follow through the details, but if you tack on these and set them side by side, they actually follow. You can follow the same. If you look at it this way, then verses 36 through 39 could be a recapitulation of Antiochus' rise to power and what he did to get there and his actions once he got there. So basically this version says that after verse 35, there's a recapitulation of all of Antiochus' rule from maybe a slightly different angle that we take from verse 36 all the way through the end of the chapter. That's one angle. And if you do that, it actually works pretty well. But there's also a more popular version from those who take Scripture seriously and are faithful that this prophecy is about the Antichrist. It clearly doesn't connect with Antiochus chronologically if we're reading it as one continuous set of events without the recapitulation. So it's going to apply to the future leader. He's going to do all of these things. Now, if you know me well enough that I will vote for option 2 on this list. I think it works very well, and it layers over quite closely with what we see as a recapitulation of those same events. However, I'm also going to say it could apply to the future Antichrist. What I do think is that there's not an either or required. It could apply to Antiochus and the Antichrist of the future. And I think Jesus' teaching on this enforces this is the truth. This may have been fulfilled entirely in Antiochus' lifetime, from whatever angle, but it also is going to apply to that Antichrist. He's going to be a man of the same kind of character. Self-oriented, thinks he's better than everything, thinks he's better than the gods, is going to set himself up as a god, is going to try to wipe out faithfulness to Yahweh. He's going to do all of the same things that Antiochus did during this period in his life. I think that's entirely a valid interpretive approach. And you can say that without denying that it is also Antiochus as a part of this prophecy.
Thank you for joining me today in the study in the book of Daniel. If you found this study helpful, please add a comment under the YouTube video. If you have a question or want to discuss something in more detail, hop over to Facebook and find the Storeroom of Scripture discussion group where we can further the discussion. Or you can email me directly at storeroomofscripture@comcast.net. Thanks again, and I hope you'll join me in our continuing study in the book of Daniel as we unpack the treasures in the biblical text.